Tonight, we're going to peel back the crusty curtain of time and sink our teeth into a truth far too few textbooks dare to admit. Medieval food sucked. Not in a not enough seasoning kind of way. Not in a please send this back to the kitchen kind of way. It sucked in the way that makes you grateful for instant noodles and sad hospital salads. So before we get cozy under your weighted blanket and pretend the past was charming, do me a favor, like the video. Subscribe if you haven't, and comment below what time it is for you. Because somewhere out there, someone is eating a microwave burrito at 3 a.m., and trust me, it's still better than what a medieval peasant had. Now dim the lights, turn on a fan, and let's travel back to a world of rotten turnips, centuries-old beer, and bread that could chip your teeth. You're not a noble. You're not a knight. You're just you, stuck in the dirt and very, very hungry. You wake up hungry. But medieval hungry isn't modern hungry. It's not, oops, I skipped dinner hungry. It's my body is starting to eat itself and my stomach sounds like a haunted kettle hungry. You're in a thatch-roofed hut. The air smells like damp wood, livestock, and regret. Your blanket is a sackcloth. Your bed is hay. The rats are your roommates. You stumble out of your straw pile and sniff the air for breakfast. You will not like what you find. Because the concept of breakfast, as we know it, didn't really exist. You got up and got to work. On lucky days, you might shove something in your mouth on the way to the fields. That something? Pottage. Not porridge. Pottage. A sludge made from yesterday's barley, onions, and whatever was still clinging to life in your storage pit. Sometimes beans. Sometimes peas. Always sad. If you're a noble, you might get some day-old bread, cheese, maybe dried fruit. But you're not. You're a peasant. Your breakfast has been fermenting since last week in a wooden bowl so cracked it might qualify as a religious relic. And this isn't comfort food. It's survival food. It doesn't nourish. It just delays death. You spoon the lukewarm goop into your mouth, trying not to crunch on the bit of dirt you accidentally added while digging it out of the pot with your unwashed hands. Congratulations, you're fueled for a 14-hour workday. And just to be clear, this is the best meal you're likely to get all day. Let's talk about bread. Because when people picture medieval food, they imagine hearty loaves pulled from rustic ovens, golden crusts, warm steam, happy villagers. No, bread was the foundation of the medieval diet. But this wasn't artisan sourdough. It was more like punishment in loaf form. Peasant bread was made from whatever grains hadn't molded, been stolen, or eaten by rats. Barley, rye, sometimes oats. And if things were bad, and they often were, acorns, ferns, or ground-up tree bark. It wasn't fluffy, it wasn't soft. It was dense, dark, and sour, the kind of bread that judges you as you eat it. And here's where things get tragic. Because the mill that ground your flour probably used a stone wheel, which means tiny flecks of rock ended up in your bread. So over time, your teeth wore down. Chewing literally ground your molars to powder. By 40, you're missing half your teeth. By 50, you're gumming your way through life. And if you're lucky, your bread had enough mold on it to qualify as penicillin. If you weren't, it had enough ergot to send you on a hallucinogenic nightmare ride straight into the arms of the local priest. But that's not the worst part. Sometimes bread was so bad, it wasn't even eaten. It was used as a plate, a trencher, a stale hunk of crusty bread that held your food. And when you were done, you threw it away. Or fed it to the poor, or the dogs, the usual. So yes, bread was life. But it was also death, one bite at a time. Let's say by some miracle, you managed to get meat. Maybe a bird flew into your house and died. Maybe someone bribed a local lord. Maybe a pig got struck by lightning. You're excited. It's meat. Bad news. That meat is about to turn. Refrigeration doesn't exist. Salt is expensive. You might have access to smoke, but that only works if you know how to use it and have time. So what do? You boil it. Heavily. Aggressively, until it stops twitching and starts falling apart like a bad dream. The result is a flavorless gray mush with the texture of damp wool. You season it with whatever herbs survived the frost and call it a stew. The nobles had better. They got venison, boar, roast swan, but even they had no concept of fresh. Meat was aged to the edge of danger, then buried under so many spices, it could pass for edible. If it smelled bad, you added vinegar. If it moved, you ignored it. And sometimes, meat wasn't even meat. In Lent and other fasting periods, people ate fake meat. imitation animal made from fish or vegetables, shaped to look like chicken legs. Because nothing says spiritual purity like fish pretending to be duck. And let's not forget the horrors of sausage, a noble delicacy but a peasant gamble. Ground mystery meat stuffed into an intestine casing and aged just long enough to make you pray. So yes, you might get meat, but you'll wish you hadn't. You think dairy is safe? That's adorable. Milk, if you had a cow or a goat, went bad within hours. You couldn't just pop it in the fridge and go live your life. It spoiled fast, real fast. So what did you do? You turned it into something else. Butter, cheese, clabber, whatever your culture's version of solidified lactose panic was. Medieval butter was a greasy, salty, often rancid mess. Cheese ranged from hard as brick to soft as sin. And since hygiene was more suggestion than law, dairy products were often crawling with invisible horrors. But you ate them anyway, because calories mattered more than bacteria. A spoonful of curdled milk was still better than nothing, even if it made your stomach fight back with the vengeance of a betrayed god. And if you were lucky enough to own a cow, that cow was your lifeline. You fed it before yourself. You named it. You prayed over it. And when it died, your entire winter plan died with it. Also, fun fact, cows in the Middle Ages didn't produce much milk. You weren't dealing with industrialized udders. You got just enough milk to argue over, then start praying again. So, you've gagged your way through breakfast sludge and barely chewable bread. You're now headed to the field, stomach half full, teeth already eroding from gravel-laced grain, and guess what? There's no snack break. There are no oat bars, no bananas in a lunchbox. You might suck on a boiled onion if you're lucky. If not, you power through on rage, religious guilt, and the faint memory of cheese. By midday, your body starts demanding fuel. But instead of a hot plate or a packed lunch, you get something resembling punishment in a bowl. Welcome to lunch. It's probably more pottage, the same batch, still lukewarm, still sad. Maybe someone tossed in a wild herb. Maybe not. It's the medieval version of leftovers, except leftovers imply you had something worth saving. If you're a field worker, you're eating on the ground, surrounded by flies, chickens, and the sounds of someone coughing up plague in the distance. You don't talk. You don't pause. You eat, chew, swallow, return to labor, because the Lord's harvest doesn't wait for your peasant appetite. And by the way, utensils? Maybe a wooden spoon. Knives were for cutting, not eating. If you thought water would save you, think again. Medieval water was less hydration and more lottery. A sip could quench your thirst or kill you. Rivers were toilets, wells were shallow, rain barrels bred mosquitoes like cursed soup. Clean water was a rumor. So what did people drink instead? Beer. Weak, sour, cloudy beer, sometimes called small beer. It wasn't alcohol in the party sense. It was desperation in a cup. Barely fermented, low on alcohol, high on not being lethal. Kids drank it. Monks drank it. You drank it. Because the alternative was dysentery. You didn't get drunk. You got slightly hydrated and maybe less dead. And when beer ran out, you boiled herbs, nettles, dandelions, bitter roots. You made tea that tasted like a curse but kept the diarrhea at bay. If you were rich, you had wine, heavily watered, spiced, and sour. But you're not rich. You're chewing on a reed and praying for rain. Now let's visit the garden. Peasants grew vegetables, but not the colorful, crunchy kind you Instagram. Think dirt-stained roots, turnips, leeks, onions, cabbage. The holy quartet of sadness. Cabbage was the king, boiled till mushy, smelled like wet dog and disappointment. You ate it anyway, because vitamins. There were no tomatoes, no potatoes, no peppers. Those came from the Americas, centuries too late to save your dinner. Peasants had to get creative. They pickled, they dried, they fermented, not for flavor, for survival. Stew was everything. Vegetables boiled into sludge, maybe with a marrow bone if you had a friend at the butcher. The result was edible, barely. And if you were lucky, you got garlic, just enough to cover the flavor of decay. Let's talk rot, because it wasn't a mistake, it was a strategy. Fermentation was how you stayed alive. No refrigeration, so you turned spoilage into an art. Milk became cheese, cabbage became sauerkraut, grain became ale, meat became jerky or sausage. It wasn't gourmet. It was biological warfare on hunger. But it worked, and it tasted aggressive. Imagine biting into something that smells like old feet but keeps you warm in January. That's medieval cuisine. You didn't eat because it tasted good. You ate because not eating was worse. And don't forget salt. Salt was life. Salt preserved fish, meat, vegetables. It was currency. Wars were fought over it. If you had salt, you could store meat for winter. If not, you had to bury it, smoke it, or pray hard. Salted cod was a staple, even if you lived nowhere near the sea. It was dried like leather, then boiled until barely chewable. The flavor? Imagine sadness soaked in seawater. That's your dinner, every Friday, for religious reasons. You didn't even get meat, just dried fish in silence. What about dessert? Hilarious. Sugar was a luxury. If you were rich, you got honey cakes, spiced figs, candied nuts. If you were poor, you got berries in season. Maybe some boiled apples. No ice cream. No cookies. Just slightly warm fruit mash that may or may not contain worms. You ate it with gratitude. Or not at all. Now imagine all this, eaten in the dark. Because lighting was expensive. You had a tallow candle if you were lucky. It smelled like old meat and smoke. You ate in shadow, with your hands, while rats watched. Because that was medieval dining. Romantic, right? So you've chewed through pottage, chewed through bread that could double as roof tiles, and tried not to die from fish jerky. Now let's visit the marketplace, assuming you had anything to trade, because coins were rare. Most peasants operated on barter. Eggs for onions, wool for ale, a chicken for a broken hoe. But if you made it to a market day, congratulations. You're about to be overwhelmed by smells. Not the good kind. The kind that makes your stomach question its life choices. There's raw meat hanging in the sun. Fish piled on wooden boards, now attracting flies by the dozen. Open barrels of pickles, vinegar, and sour beer. Nothing is cold. Nothing is clean. And every vendor swears their produce is fresh. You know it isn't. But what choice do you have? The baker's stall has bread that looks like it's been in a fist fight. The butcher's cart is leaking something red onto the cobblestones. There's cheese, but it's sweating. Fruit that's overripe. Herbs that are wilting. And behind it all, a cloud of flies thick enough to block the sun. You make your trade. A few eggs for a lump of dried sausage. Maybe a crust of bread with visible mold. You walk home proud. You've got dinner. Now let's enter the kitchen. Except it's not a kitchen. It's a corner of your one-room hut, a fire pit, a hook for hanging pots. Maybe a wooden shelf. You cook over open flame. Smoke fills the room. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof that sort of works. Your eyes water, your lungs burn. But hey, warm food is coming. You boil water from the stream. You skim off the bugs. You toss in your vegetables, your grain, maybe that sausage. You stir with a stick, and you wait. Hours pass. The smell is tolerable. Dinner is ready. You serve it in a cracked bowl with a wooden spoon. Everyone eats fast, because if you're slow, the rats might get there first. Let's talk about the rats. They lived with you, ate with you, sometimes on you. They liked the pantry, the straw bedding, the warmth of your oven. You didn't name them, but you recognized them. They had patterns, territories. You respected each other, kind of, until one of them chewed through your sack of grain. Then it was war, but you never won. Sometimes, though, your food fought back, not rats. The actual food. Grains could grow mold that made you hallucinate. Ergot poisoning. A fungal terror that mimicked LSD and caused madness, seizures, even death. People thought they were cursed, possessed, haunted by demons. But really, they just ate bad rye. Let's also mention famine, because it wasn't rare. It was routine. Crops failed. Rain didn't come, or came too much, or came with locusts. One bad season, and your whole village could starve. You ate bark, boiled leather, grass. You ate your shoes, your belts. You ate pets. Sometimes in whispers, people ate worse. We don't talk about that. And disease? Oh, disease loved medieval food. It danced on the knives, slept in the flour, swam in your soup. Botulism, typhoid, cholera, parasites in pork, worms in fish, eggs in your stomach. There were no labels, no regulations, no expiration dates. If it looked okay and didn't smell like hell, you ate it. And sometimes even when it did. Let's check in on the nobles. Surely they had it better, right? In a way, they had more food, but also more ways to ruin it. They overcooked everything, drenched it in spices, covered rotting meat with sauces thick enough to build houses. They thought food should be symbolic. A roast peacock served with its feathers reattached, a pie that exploded with live birds, bread shaped like castles, food as entertainment. But underneath the spectacle, the same problems. Bad hygiene, no refrigeration, questionable meat. The rich just masked it better, with saffron and illusion. And the rules. So many food rules. The church dictated when and what you could eat. Fasting on Fridays. No meat during Lent. Feast days, saints' days, market days. Everyone had opinions. Everyone had guilt. Food was spiritual, political, personal, and mostly out of your control. Now let's visit winter. Not Christmas, not cozy, not mulled wine and wool socks winter. Real winter. Medieval winter. A season so unforgiving it made strong men cry and cheese freeze solid. It starts in October. Harvests are in. Fields are bare. Nights come early. And your food, it has to last until April. That's 6 months of rationing, of pickles, of dried beans, of cabbage so old it has its own accent. You eat less. You move less. You wrap yourself in straw and try not to think about your shrinking stash. Spoilage is the enemy. If your root cellar floods or freezes, your carrots turn to mush. Your onions sprout, your grains mold, and you can't fix it. You just watch it rot. By January, meals are smaller. Porridge thinned with water, stew stretched with turnips. Maybe you scrape the last fat from the sausage skin. You chew it slowly, pretend it's satisfying. Your kids complain, your bones ache, the fire dies out faster. Hunger becomes a roommate, always there, always humming in the background. By February, you're eating boiled nettles. Again, you tell yourself it's healthy, but it tastes like punishment. And March is despair. The last cabbage is black. The flour is gone. You start trading things, blankets, tools, anything for a sack of oats. If that fails, you forage. Bark, roots, frogs, anything that moves. Then, spring. And the worst part? There's still nothing. Crops aren't ready. Livestock are thin. The snow is gone, but the hunger stays. It will be months before you see a fresh egg, a plump carrot, a green leaf, and by then, half your village might be dead. Let's talk preservation, because without it, winter meant death. You salted fish until it became wood. You dried meat on racks. You stored apples in hay. You pickled everything. Cucumbers, turnips, eggs, even your sense of taste. And smoking. Smoke was flavor. Smoke was life. You smoked hams until they were black. Hung them over the fire. Let them age like despair. The flavor? Think leather marinated in ash. But it kept you alive. And when something did go bad, you tried to save it. Scraped the mold. Cut the green parts. Boiled it longer. Always longer. You didn't waste food. You couldn't. Even bad food had value. Even sour milk became cheese. Even rotten bread fed pigs. And even pigs became bacon. Speaking of pigs, let's discuss animals. Because meat wasn't meat until something died. And killing something wasn't easy. Pigs were loud. They screamed. Chickens flapped. Cows looked you in the eyes. Slaughter was a ritual, a moral burden. A messy business done in winter when meat could last longer. You saved the blood for pudding, the organs for stew. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be. Even bones had value. You boiled them for broth, cracked them for marrow, used them for tools. You didn't toss bones. You respected them because they were the last gift from the animal. And you might not get another one for months. And now let's talk hunger. Not boredom hunger, not snack at midnight hunger. Real hunger, the kind that eats your muscles, that dulls your brain, that makes you dream of bread and wake up chewing your own sleeve. Hunger was normal, chronic. Background noise. Children cried themselves to sleep. Adults worked through dizziness. Old people quietly gave up meals for others. Famine wasn't a surprise. It was a pattern. Let's talk about feasts, because if you've made it this far, you deserve a break. A medieval feast sounds like a dream. Tables of food, roasted animals, endless ale. But here's the truth. You're not invited. You're a peasant. You're outside, watching through a crack in the manor window as nobles tear into swan, toss bones over their shoulders, and get drunk before sunset. A feast for you? Maybe on a saint's day. Maybe at a wedding, a bowl of pottage with meat in it, a slice of bread that isn't moldy. You call it luxury. They call it scraps. Inside, the nobles are eating absurdities, a boar's head with apples for eyes, peacock cooked and redressed in feathers, pies that bleed gravy when sliced. It looks incredible. It tastes questionable. The meat is old, the sauce is overspiced, the texture is soggy, but it's not about flavor, it's about wealth. Display, control. The feast says, we have food, you don't. Remember that. Meanwhile, the kitchen is chaos. Dozens of servants, fires burning hot, pots boiling, knives flashing. It smells like sweat, grease, and panic. Food is undercooked, overcooked, dropped, wiped, and served. Nobody cares, nobody notices. The nobles are drunk, the music is loud, and outside, you're still chewing boiled turnip. Now let's rewind, back to daily life. Let's talk monotony, because medieval eating wasn't just additive. The same ingredients, the same meals, day after day. year after year. No variety, no experimentation, just survival. You didn't ask, what am I in the mood for? You asked, what hasn't gone bad yet? Your palate didn't grow. It adapted. You stopped caring about flavor. You started caring about filling the hole. There were no recipes, not for peasants. You learned from watching, from trial and error, from hunger. Measurements didn't exist. You used handfuls, pinches, gut instinct. And if it tasted terrible, you said nothing. Because wasting food was a sin. You chewed in silence, you swallowed hard, and you tried not to think about it. Let's talk about cookware. Wooden bowls, iron pots, clay jugs, all handmade, all fragile. Pots cracked, bowls leaked. You used them anyway. Spoons were treasures, knives were tools. You didn't have 10 forks and a salad plate. You had one thing, maybe two, and you guarded them like gold. Cleanliness? A fantasy. You rinsed things, maybe scrubbed with sand. No soap, no disinfectant, just hope. You didn't know what bacteria were, but you feared the consequences. Diarrhea, vomiting, fever, death, all from a bad stew, all from a spoon that wasn't clean enough, all from water you thought was safe. Let's visit the monastery, because monks knew something. They grew herbs, brewed beer, made cheese, preserved knowledge. Some of the only written recipes came from them. Their food was simple, clean, sacred, and still bland. Pious flavorlessness, designed to nourish the body without exciting the soul. You ate, you prayed, you worked, you repeated, forever. Now back to your peasant hut. Dinner's over. The fire is dying. You wrap yourself in whatever's dry. Your stomach growls. Again, but you ignore it. There's no more food. You sleep. You dream of roast goose, of honey cakes, of warm bread. And you wake up, back to the same bowl, the same pottage, the same terrible taste. Because food didn't bring joy. It brought survival. Let's shift from the kitchen to the table, if you had one. Most peasants didn't. You ate sitting on a stump, the floor, or standing. The table might have been a plank on 2 barrels. Plates, maybe a chunk of stale bread used as a trencher. Cups, a shared wooden mug. Cutlery, you had a knife if you were lucky. Most people ate with fingers. Clean? Not really. Communal? Always. You dipped into the same pot. You shared bites. You shared germs. Illness passed around like a second helping. Let's talk insects. Flies were constant. Mosquitoes in summer. Fleas in winter. Lice year-round. You waved them off your food. You sometimes found them in your food. Worms in apples. Beetles in grain. Larvae in dried meat. You picked them out if you could. If not, you chewed fast and tried not to think about it. Food wasn't separate from nature. It was full of it. Now imagine the smell, not the food. The room. Your home. Smoke from damp wood. Wet wool. Unwashed bodies. Fermented cabbage. Dead rats in the walls. The aroma of the Middle Ages wasn't appetizing. It was overwhelming, and food absorbed all of it. You could taste the room in your stew. Let's talk children. They ate last. They ate least. Adults needed strength to work. Kids were expected to wait, to be grateful. Sometimes to go without. They cried from hunger. Learned not to ask. Learned to chew slowly. To savor small bites. Food was discipline. Food was silence. You learned early to eat what you were given, or get nothing. Holidays were different. Christmas, Easter, harvest festivals. You might get a feast, extra bread, a slice of meat, a sweetened pudding if the priest was generous. These were the best days. The only days when food meant celebration. When eating wasn't about survival, it was about community. You remembered those meals, talked about them for years. They were rare, sacred, and they ended too fast. Then there were fasts, mandatory, religious, entire months without meat. You ate fish, eggs if allowed, bread, beans. It wasn't healthier, just stricter. Rules carved into calendars. Obedience enforced with hunger. The church monitored your plate. Your soul depended on your diet. Your stomach, it never got a vote. And spoilage wasn't always visible. Bread looked fine, but held invisible mold. Milk smelled okay, but killed the baby goat. You didn't know what went wrong. You just buried the dead and blamed demons, or witches, or your neighbor. Food had consequences. Not just hunger, but suspicion, jealousy, accusation. Someone always had more, someone always had less, and someone always paid. Food wasn't just about eating, it was about identity. Where you stood in the medieval world was written in your bowl. Peasants ate pottage, nobles ate peacocks. The gap wasn't just wealth, it was worldview. Your daily meals were a mirror of your class, your faith, your value to society. And once you were born into a meal type, you didn't escape it. Not unless something extraordinary happened, like war, or plague, or marrying absurdly well. But chances are, your food sucked at birth and sucked at death. Let's dig into class. Because nobles lived in a different food reality. They didn't eat for survival. They ate for sport, for diplomacy, for power. A noble feast wasn't about flavor. It was about message. The more exotic, the more expensive, the more absurd, the higher your status. You didn't serve chicken. You served a roasted crane. You didn't serve soup. You served swan liver broth, laced with saffron. And the saffron? Imported at great cost, just to prove you could. Nobles ate meat even when it was forbidden. They had dispensations, legal loopholes, priestly blessings, rich people magic. They justified eating whale as fish so they could still indulge on Fridays. They carved out spiritual exceptions while peasants carved dry bread. But here's the catch. The nobles still had no idea what they were doing. Their kitchens were chaotic, their cooks untrained, their ingredients unreliable, meat wasn't tested, milk wasn't pasteurized, spices were often fake, ground brick dust for cinnamon, dyed bark for saffron. The food might look grand but taste like failure. It didn't matter, it was spectacle, prestige on a plate. Meanwhile, peasants ate onion soup and stared at the castle wall. Now let's talk plagues. Because nothing reshaped food quite like mass death. When the Black Death hit, food production collapsed, fields were abandoned, markets dried up, prices soared. Starvation followed. But after the first few waves of horror, something strange happened. Labor shortages made workers more valuable. Wages rose, food got better for a while. Some peasants ate more meat, drank better ale, grew bold, but the nobles hated it. Laws were passed to restrict peasant diets. You can't wear this. You can't eat that. Food became a tool of control. Again, your stomach was a political target. The taste of bread became a battleground. Now let's wander into the forest. Foraging was risky, but sometimes necessary. Berries, mushrooms, nuts, greens. But mushrooms? A minefield. One wrong cap and you're dead by morning. Or worse, paralyzed, or hallucinating yourself into the river. Foraging wasn't instinct, it was inherited knowledge, passed down, guarded. If your grandmother said, "Don't eat that," you listened. If she was wrong, you buried her and took notes. And what about hunting? Illegal for peasants. Forests were the property of the king or the lord. Poaching was a crime, sometimes punishable by death. So you trapped rabbits in secret, hunted birds in the dusk, cooked meat in hidden fires. If caught, you lied. It died on its own. It came into my yard. You hoped the Lord believed you. He usually didn't. Let's go deeper. The mental toll. Food insecurity isn't just physical, it's psychological. You lived with hunger. You planned every bite. You felt guilt for eating too much. You feared not eating enough. You dreamed of full bellies. You woke to emptiness. Your whole existence bent around managing scarcity. You didn't trust good fortune. If a meal was rich, you suspected a trick, or a curse, or that you'd pay for it later, with sickness or sin. And often, you did. Now let's return to tools. The mortar and pestle, essential. Used to grind herbs, mash roots, pound grain. Knives, rare, expensive, handed down, sharpened on stone, never wasted. Cauldrons were family heirlooms, cast iron or bronze. If it cracked, your cooking life shattered. You boiled everything in one pot. That pot held dinner, dye, soap making, and sometimes medicinal herbs. The flavor? Confusing, but practical. You made do. Kitchen fire was the enemy and the savior. It cooked your food. It heated your room. It burned your hands. Fires got out of control easily. Thatch roofs caught. Wooden beams smoldered. You lost your home because someone knocked over a candle. You lost your soup and your shelter. Fire was risk and necessity. You feared it. You needed it. Like everything else in the medieval world. Now let's move to the church again. Because food wasn't just about rules, it was about morality. Gluttony was a sin. Fasting was virtue. The body was weak. The soul needed discipline. You were taught to deny yourself, to resist indulgence. Even if indulgence meant eating meat once a week, you were supposed to be hungry. That meant you were holy. The saints starved. So should you. The ideal Christian had a clean heart, a quiet mind, and an empty stomach. Women had it worse. Cooking was their role, their duty, their responsibility. But they had no power, no money, no say in what was bought. They were expected to feed the family from scraps, from foraged weeds, from leftovers. A good woman stretched a meal. A bad one let the pot run dry. Praise was rare, criticism constant, and when famine hit, they fed others before themselves, then died quietly in spring. Let's talk insects again. Grain beetles, weevils, moths. Your flour moved when you stirred it. Your bread had crunch, not from seeds, from legs. You tried to sift, to shake, to ignore. You baked the bugs in. You ate them. Protein, you said. Survival, you whispered. Nobody laughed. Now let's take a journey, a pilgrimage. A journey meant walking for weeks, carrying food, hoping for handouts, stopping at monasteries for stale bread and boiled beans. You packed salted fish, dried fruit, maybe hard cheese. You lost weight, gained blisters, prayed a lot, ate less, because a holy trip didn't come with holy catering. And trade changed everything. Spices from the east, sugar from colonies, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, all came later, all came slowly. At first, only the richest could afford them. But slowly, painfully, flavor crept into Europe, one ship at a time, one bloody conquest at a time. Behind every sweet or spicy improvement was a shadow of war, of slavery, of empire. Even good food had a cost. Eventually, towns grew, markets improved, guilds formed, bakers, butchers, brewers. Food got safer, maybe. Bread was regulated, sort of. Beer was standardized, sometimes, but even then fraud was rampant. Bread sold with chalk, beer thinned with water. You had to know your seller, you had to trust. And trust was hard when your neighbor once sold you a pigeon as a partridge. Now let's talk myth. Medieval people believed in food magic. Garlic warded off evil. Bread blessed by a priest could cure disease. A leek worn around the neck kept you strong. Some foods healed, some harmed. Superstition filled every pantry. You didn't eat certain foods on certain days. You never stirred with your left hand. You never spilled salt without throwing a pinch over your shoulder. Not because it helped, but because not doing it might curse your harvest, or your child, or your soul. Even the act of chewing was debated. Some monks chewed slowly to stay pure. Others fasted from speaking during meals, eating in total silence while holy texts were read aloud. Eating wasn't private, it was public. A ritual, a performance, a discipline. Let's return to the poor. Because most people were. You didn't have choice. You didn't have seasoning. You didn't have variety. You had hunger and hope. Hope that the beans wouldn't burn, that the barley wouldn't rot, that the turnip would last another week. Hope that next year's harvest would be better, that the rains would come, that the pigs would breed, that the stew would stretch, that your children would grow, that the bread wouldn't crack your last molar, that the priest wouldn't take your eggs, that the Lord wouldn't raise taxes, that the rats would find another house. But mostly, hope that tomorrow, when you woke up, there would still be food in the pot. And now we reach the silence after the meal. The moment where your belly is technically full, but your body doesn't believe it. You sit by the fire, such as it is, and listen. The wind outside, the creak of wood, maybe a cough. The feeling that tomorrow's meal will be no better than today's. You don't count calories. You count hours between chewing. Your life is measured not in luxury, but in spoons of barley. And in that silence, food isn't just physical anymore. It becomes something deeper, an ache, a fear, a memory. You remember a good meal from childhood, a goose, a pie, an apple. You don't remember the taste, but the moment. And that's what food really is in the medieval world. A fleeting victory against decay, a warm pause in the cold, a reminder you're still alive, barely. Let's talk about the animals again. Chickens were life. Eggs meant protein. You guarded your hens like gold. Foxes were enemies, so were hawks. You lost a chicken, you lost your breakfast. Pigs were wealth. They grew fat on scraps and turned into bacon. Cows meant milk, but more often they were work animals, and when they got old, they became stew. You raised animals not for affection, but for calories. And when the time came, you killed them with a knife you'd been using since your wedding. Let's revisit cooking fuel. Wood was currency. Forest access was limited. You needed permission to gather fallen branches. No cutting live trees, that was theft, so you burned dung, peat, old straw. The fire smoked. Everything tasted vaguely like cow. You learned to adapt, not because it was fun, but because there was no other option. Now let's talk garbage, or rather, there wasn't any. Nothing was wasted. Bones became broth. Vegetable peels went to pigs. Ashes became lye. Old bread fed ducks. Spoiled milk became sour cheese. Your trash was someone else's treasure, or at least someone else's meal. Even the moldy grain you didn't trust to eat yourself, you baked into dog bread. Yes, there was such a thing. Bread so rough and bitter, it was only for animals. And when you ran out of that, you fed them boiled weeds. And here's a dark one, infant feeding. No formula, no baby food, no bottles. Babies drank from mothers, or wet nurses, or soaked bread in milk, when you had milk. If you didn't, you prayed. Infant mortality wasn't just common, it was expected. Sometimes when famine hit, women stopped lactating, babies starved, and there was nothing anyone could do. Festivals gave you hope. The harvest feast, the midwinter feast. They were explosions of flavor in a desert of bland. People danced, sang, ate till they cried. These were the rare moments where food was more than fuel. It was joy, and maybe that's why they stuck so hard in the memory. Because for one day, your stomach wasn't a battlefield. Back to the city. Urban food sucked in a different way. Markets were bigger, but corruption ran deep. Butchers watered down meat. Bakers sold lightweight loaves. The bread police were real. Inspectors checked weights, quality, punished fraud sometimes, but often they took bribes. You could buy bread with plaster inside, beer with wood chips. You had to know who to trust or suffer the consequences. Now on to drinks again. We talked beer, but there was also mead, honey wine, rare, expensive, sweet, reserved for weddings and saints. Cider in apple regions, strong, unfiltered, hit like a hammer. Wine, thin and sour, mostly for clergy and nobles, watered down, always suspect. You drank carefully, not out of taste but strategy. Let's go medical. Food was medicine, and medicine was food. Onions for fever, garlic for plague, ale for digestion. You believed certain foods balanced your humors. Cold, hot, wet, dry. Too much heat? Eat cucumber. Too much cold? Drink wine. A bad stomach? Avoid cheese. It wasn't science. It was survival mythology. But it sometimes worked, even if nobody knew why. There were food disasters, spoiled grains, bad meat, outbreaks of poisoning, entire villages wiped out by one bad loaf. Ergot outbreaks mimicked madness. People twitched, screamed, tore off clothes, ran into the woods. They were exorcised, hunted, but really, they just ate the wrong rye, and no one knew. That was the scariest part. And what about food theft? Common, dangerous. You stole a loaf, you risked a hand, or branding, or worse, hunger made criminals, and the law had no mercy. Children were punished. Mothers were jailed. Food was sacred because it was scarce, and anything scarce becomes guarded, even violently. Now let's go philosophical. In the medieval mind, food was sacred. It came from God. Famine was punishment. Feast was reward. Rain was divine mercy. Drought was wrath. You didn't just eat, you gave thanks. You prayed before every bite. You fasted out of guilt, shared out of obligation, starved out of respect. Hunger wasn't just physical, it was theological. And when you sinned, you didn't confess, you fasted. When you repented, you gave food to the poor. Food was a spiritual transaction. Let's revisit children one more time, because their experience shaped the future. A child born into a bad harvest year had stunted growth, weak bones, thin teeth, their entire health profile warped by the first 5 years. Some recovered, most didn't. And so generation after generation carried malnutrition like a curse. Let's go seasonal. Spring brought greens, wild sorrel, garlic, nettles, a brief burst of nutrition. Summer was work, preserving, drying, salting. Autumn was harvest, apples, nuts, squash. Winter was punishment. Every month tasted different. Every month was a new threat. Your cooking calendar was the sky, the moon, the frost. No Google recipes, just instinct. You knew when the apples would fall, when the beans would mold, when the cows would dry up. You lived by the land's mood swings. And the land didn't care about your hunger. And so we returned to where we started. You, hungry, wrapped in wool, a bowl of pottage in your lap, a sliver of cheese you're saving for later. You chew slowly, carefully. You don't waste a bite, because food is fleeting, because you don't know what tomorrow brings. Because in the medieval world, food isn't pleasure, it isn't art, it isn't even guaranteed. And most of all, food in the medieval world sucked. So next time your delivery order is late or your soup isn't hot enough, just remember, at least your bread won't grind your teeth into dust. At least your stew doesn't hiss back. You wake up in the middle of the night, not because of a nightmare, not because of the cold, not even because the rats are wrestling over a turnip near the fire pit again. You're awake because you're hungry, deep, aching, primal hunger. The kind that hollows your gut and whispers in your bones. You stare at the ceiling, wooden beams covered in soot. You know there's no food left, not tonight, not tomorrow morning, maybe not for days. And still, your stomach growls because it doesn't know how to give up. Food in the medieval world wasn't just an event. It was a force. It governed time. It decided where you worked, how long you lived, how many children you had, how many survived. You didn't plan your day and then fit food into it. You planned your day around food, around acquiring it, preserving it, cooking it, serving it, and rationing it. Always rationing it, because there was never enough. Breakfast is the word we use. They didn't. You didn't break a fast. You just started moving. And if you were lucky, there was something in the pot left over from last night's soup. You didn't expect flavor. You didn't expect satisfaction. You expected calories. And if the pot was empty, you chewed a crust of bread so hard it left your jaw sore for hours. You dipped it in water or wine or broth to soften it. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. You step outside. It's still dark. The wind bites. The sky is the color of iron. You walk to the well. You draw water. It smells slightly of moss and earth. You don't complain. You take what you can get. Back inside, you build a fire. It takes time. The wood is damp. The smoke makes your eyes sting. You boil water. You toss in barley, a few limp greens, maybe a bit of animal fat if you had any. It smells like boiled history. You sip. You try not to gag. This is your life. Let's walk down the street. Your neighbors are doing the same. Their kitchens are identical. Smoky, damp, quiet. Everyone's trying to eat before the work begins. The men head to the fields, the women to spinning or sewing or childcare. The children follow whichever adult seems least annoyed by them. No one talks about food. No one says, "This tastes good." That would be absurd. What's there to say about swamp cabbage and week-old peas? We reach the baker's hut. He's been awake since midnight. His oven has been burning since before you even rolled off your hay bed. He bakes for the whole village. Flat loaves, rough loaves, dark loaves, loaves so dense you could use them to repair a wall. He sells what he can. The rest goes to the Lord. The tax is taken in flour, bread, labor. If you're short, you pay in favors, or chickens, or silence. Now we walk to the Lord's manor. Bigger kitchens, more people, better ingredients. But the same problems. The meat is old. The fish is half rotten. The spices are fresh, but only because they're the only thing that's been imported this year. The cook is yelling. A servant dropped a haunch of venison into the hearth. It's covered in ash now. They'll scrape it off and serve it anyway. Because wasting food? That's blasphemy. Upstairs, the Lord and Lady are pretending everything tastes wonderful. They chew slowly, deliberately. They use knives and forks. The knives are sharp, the forks are new, imported from Italy. Their guests are impressed, or pretend to be. They sip watered wine. They nibble at stuffed goose. It's slightly sour. No one says anything. Meanwhile, back in the village, a child eats a boiled egg. One egg, shared with his sister. They don't argue. They know the rules. Half each, no complaints. Their mother watches them. She doesn't eat. She says she's not hungry. She is, but she's learned to lie to her body. Let's talk about food law. Yes, food was regulated. Even then. The assize of bread, a medieval law that fixed the price and weight of bread. If a baker cheated, fines, whippings. In some towns, they were put in the stocks, publicly humiliated, because bread was serious. Bread was the line between order and chaos, between civility and riot. Markets had inspectors sometimes. They checked weights. They smelled meat. They watched for watered wine and sour milk. But corruption was everywhere. A butcher bribes a guard. A fisherman dumps spoiled catch into the river, calls it fresh. A cheese merchant cuts mold off with a clean knife, then uses the same knife to cut your slice. You buy it anyway. You can't afford to be picky. Now let's visit a monastery. Silence, prayer, discipline. But the food? Surprisingly decent. Monks grew herbs, kept bees, brewed beer, made cheese. Their diets were simple. Bread, cheese, ale, but cleaner, more consistent. Their cellars were stocked, their kitchens organized. They wrote recipes, tracked ingredients, preserved knowledge. And still, no garlic, no onions. Too worldly, too exciting. You ate to fill your belly, not your desires. Back to the peasant's hut. It's evening now. You're back from the fields. Your hands are blistered. Your feet are wet. You've earned dinner. But dinner isn't waiting. It needs to be made. You crush some garlic, rare but precious. You chop cabbage, boil lentils, stir until it thickens. It's pottage again. It always is. You eat in silence. The fire crackles. Your child coughs. You don't ask if they're okay. You just hope they make it through the night. And then it's over. The pot is empty. You scrape the sides. You lick your spoon. You place it carefully beside your mat. Tomorrow, you'll use it again and again until the handle breaks. Then you'll whittle a new one. Food was never just about taste, it was about effort. Firewood, water, clay, muscle, patience. It was work. Every bite was labor, every meal a miracle. And somehow, it still sucked. Let's leave the village and visit the roads. You're a traveler now, on pilgrimage, or fleeing war, or seeking work. There's no fast food, no inns on every corner. If you're lucky, you find a monastery. They give you bread, ale, sometimes cheese. If not, you beg. You knock on a door. You offer labor for soup. Some say yes, some slam the door. Others steal what little you carry. And if night falls with no meal, you sleep on your hunger. You learn to chew grass. You pick berries. You boil roots if you can find wood. But mostly you walk, hungry. Now you reach a town, bigger, louder, smellier. The market is alive. Vendors shout, pigs scream, chickens flap. The fishmonger dumps eels on a slab of stone. The butcher sharpens knives with a grin too wide. Everything is for sale. Everything smells like salt and rot. You buy a loaf. It's warm, dense, and has a small pebble baked into the middle. You spit it out. Keep eating. You won't complain, because it's food. A stranger offers soup. You hesitate. Is it safe? You drink anyway. It tastes like onion and smoke. Later, your stomach turns. Too late to fix it. You retch behind a cart. A dog watches. You wipe your mouth. Keep walking. That's medieval food safety. Let's sit in on a wedding. A rare joy. The whole village celebrates. The Lord slaughters a pig. There's bread, ale, even honey cakes. Children laugh. Adults dance. For once, no one worries about tomorrow's dinner. You eat until you feel dizzy. You savor it. You try to burn the flavor into your memory because you know it won't happen again for years. Now let's talk about pickling. Cabbage, onions, eggs, even fruit. Vinegar was precious. It preserved life. You stored jars in the cellar, pulled them out midwinter. The crunch, the sourness. It reminded you of warmer days. It reminded you that someone in your family once planned ahead, and you silently thanked them as you chewed. You also dried everything. Apples hung on strings, beans shriveled in baskets, meat smoked until leathery, bread toasted into hard cakes. You ground them later with water into a porridge. Nothing was wasted. Even the smell of boiling cabbage was reused. It clung to your clothes for days. Let's return to the animals. You raise rabbits. They breed fast. You feed them scraps. You pet them. Then one day you wring their necks. You skin them. You stew them. Your child cries. You tell them this is how life works. They stop crying. Next time, they help. We revisit the sea. Fish was food and punishment. Salted cod, dried herring. The ocean was far, but the church demanded fish, so it was brought inland. Reeking, tough. You boiled it with garlic, chewed the bones, choked once, laughed it off. Fish was cheap religion. Your plate, a flat rock, a slab of wood, a piece of stale bread. You ate with fingers, spoons if lucky, knives if rich. No forks, not yet. You licked the plate, wiped it with crust, handed it to the next person. Sanitary? No. Practical? Always. Let's end the day. You curl up in straw, your belly not full, but not empty. You've eaten worse. You whisper a prayer, not for wealth, not for love, for food, for one more meal, for one more pot of stew, for one more spring. And that was a good day. You wake up coughing, not from smoke this time, but from something colder, a breeze slipping through the thatch. You don't want to get up, you're sore, your limbs ache, but your stomach growls louder than your joints. The fire's gone out. Again, the ashes are cold. The pot from last night is crusted over. You scrape the sides. A bit of dried barley. You chew it like jerky. It cracks like shell. Welcome to breakfast. Today's not just cold, it's damp, and damp means mold. You check your bread stash. 2 loaves are green, 1 is blue. You scrape, you sniff, you sigh, you eat anyway. Not because you don't care, but because you don't have a choice. Mold is just seasoning now. If it hasn't killed you by now, it probably won't. Probably. You head outside. The path is mud. Your shoes are straw-wrapped leather. They soak through in minutes. Your toes go numb. You walk to the mill. The miller is awake, angry. Always is. He says the river's low, less power, less flour. He shrugs like it's your fault. You leave with half the grain you expected. Your week just got harder. Back home, you boil water. Again, you toss in a root, bitter. No idea what it is. You hope it's not poison. You've eaten it before. Maybe. You can't remember. Everything blurs together now. You drink slowly. It tastes like dirt and regret. Still better than nothing. Let's visit the salt works. Salt white gold. Priceless. You trade tools for a handful. It stings your fingers. It preserves your meat. It burns your tongue. You use it sparingly. A pinch here, a dash there. Too much? It kills. Too little, everything rots. Salt is science and luck and a little bit of prayer. Now we visit the alewife. She brews beer, small beer, barely alcoholic, cloudy, sour, hydrating. She stirs it with a stick as long as her arm. She tosses in herbs, nettle, yarrow, maybe something stronger. You drink a cup. It's warm, rough, alive. You feel the bacteria wrestling in your gut. You don't stop them. You root for them. You ask her for leftovers. She gives you mash, grain waste. You mix it with flour. Bake a flat cake. It's chewy, dense, smells like yeast and desperation. You eat it in 3 bites. You thank her. She nods without looking up. She's already stirring the next batch. Let's talk about fasting. Again, it's Wednesday. No meat, no eggs, no dairy, just fish. But you live inland, so fish becomes a suggestion. You eat dried eel or salt herring or nothing. The church says it's holy. You say it's Tuesday with more guilt. Monks debate if beaver counts as fish. It lives in water. That's good enough. The Pope agrees. You stew beaver tail. It's fatty, greasy, feels wrong. You eat it anyway. Rules are strange. Hunger is stranger. Now we go up the mountain. A herder lives there. He makes cheese. From goats, from sheep. It smells like feet, but it's precious. You trade a sack of herbs. He gives you a wheel. You carry it home like a newborn. At night, you nibble it slowly. It lasts weeks. You name it. You love it. You dream about it. When it's gone, you bury the rind. Let's talk flavor. There wasn't any. Not really. Everything tasted like wood, or ash, or iron. Spices were for nobles. Pepper was expensive. Clove was myth. Cinnamon was fantasy. You had salt, mustard seeds, sometimes vinegar, and that was it. You boiled everything. Stew was your only genre. Every dinner was gray. Every breakfast was brown. Every lunch was whatever you could find in the cracks of your storage bin. You didn't ask for seconds. You asked for survival. You seasoned with silence, garnished with grief. Let's wander to a different village, one near a forest. They eat mushrooms, sometimes. Carefully. They know the good ones. They know the bad ones. They tell stories about the wrong ones. One time a boy ate the bright red kind, thought he was a dragon, jumped in the river, died smiling. No one eats those anymore. They roast chestnuts, crush acorns, make bread from bark. Yes, bark. They boil it, grind it, mix it with flour. It's bitter, chewy. Feels like eating tree memories, but it fills the stomach. That's all it has to do. In spring, the village changes. Nettles grow. You boil them. Wild garlic sprouts. You chew the leaves raw. They sting your tongue. You find a patch of wild leeks. You feast for 2 days. Then it rains, and everything drowns. Let's visit the healer. She's old, crooked, smells like vinegar and herbs. She gives you soup. It's hot, thin, has something floating in it. Maybe a bone, maybe not. She says it'll help your stomach. You drink. It does. You leave a coin. She says keep it. You give her dried fish. She smiles. You ask her what people ate long ago, before the lords, before the taxes. She shrugs. Roots, berries, game. Nothing's changed, she says. Just more rules now, more hands in the pot. We return to your hut. It's night. You open the root cellar. Something moved. You light a candle. A rat scurries out. You sigh. You count your jars. One's missing. You check the straw. Broken. Your pickles are gone. You sit down. You don't cry. You can't afford to lose water. You boil water. Again, toss in the last of the grain. You add herbs, bitter ones. They taste like forest. The stew is thin. You sip it slowly. You think about the cheese you had last month, the one with the rind, the one you buried. You wonder if it's still there. You almost dig it up. You don't, yet. Matilda wakes to the shrill creak of the wind, forcing its way through the warped wooden slats of her cottage, carrying with it a bite that settles in her bones before she's even thrown back the blanket. The room is dark, save for the weak orange glow of dying embers in the hearth, and the air smells of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the sour tang of smoked pork that hasn't been seen in weeks. Her youngest stirs beside her, coughing into the shared blanket, and she pulls him closer, not out of warmth. There's none of that left, but instinct, the last heat left in the room housed in her body and doled out in desperation. There is no clock, no rooster call, no sunbeam to suggest dawn, only the knowledge that the day must begin before the cold makes it impossible to move. She rises from the shared mattress, a burlap sack filled with straw and regret, her knees popping like old joints on a cartwheel, and every step to the hearth is a decision between pain and purpose. The coals have nearly died. She breathes on them, feeds them twigs, and then shoves the smallest pieces of wood into the tiny fire like she's begging for it to live. She can't waste the last of the logs. Those are for emergencies, and while this certainly feels like one, it's still technically not. She adds dried peat to stretch the flame, wrapping a scarf around her neck that smells like goat because it belonged to one, and still technically does. It sleeps in the corner with the hens, adding its steaming breath to the already humid, unpleasant air. She prepares breakfast, if it can be called that, a watered-down gruel made from the dust in the bottom of the oat sack, scraped together with crushed nettle stems and a tiny pinch of salt, an amount so small it feels ceremonial rather than culinary. The children gather in silence. There are no sleepy complaints, no morning songs, no playful teasing, just 5 sets of eyes that look like they've seen war, and in a way, they have. Each bowl set before them is a battlefield won with muscle, frostbite, and prayer. The oldest eats slowly, trying to savor what cannot be savored, and the youngest spills half his portion in his haste. Matilda doesn't scold him. She just bends and licks the spilled gruel off the wooden table with her fingers, swallowing hard so she doesn't cry in front of them. Today is the first of the truly deep freeze days, the kind where water becomes ice inside your cup before you finish drinking it, and every door creaks open like it's protesting your decisions. She wraps the children in their clothes, all of them layers of linen, wool, and stitched burlap, and then layers her own tunic, once her wedding gown, now just another ragged layer against the wind. Her husband died 2 winters ago, coughing blood onto the straw until the priest stopped coming. Now she tends the plot, the children, the goat, and the silence that lingers between every breath. Outside, the sky is white, not from snow, but from frost that's frozen midair, hanging like a veil over the dying world. The path to the communal well is slick with ice, and Matilda walks it carefully, each step a gamble between balance and gravity. The bucket is heavy, not with water yet, but with expectation. She draws it up, watching her reflection in the frozen ripples, cheeks red, lips chapped, eyes dull, but alive. That alone is a miracle. Back home, she begins the task of scraping the larder walls. She finds a handful of pickled turnips, a single dried apple slice, and what might have once been a piece of cheese, now more mold than dairy. She scrapes off the blue, cuts it into 5 slivers, and distributes them like communion. The children eat them with the reverence of saints. Lunchtime comes and goes without ceremony. There's nothing new to eat, so they pretend to be full. She distracts them with stories of summer festivals, of fresh berries and warm bread, of honeyed milk and roasted goose. Lies, mostly, but beautiful ones. Her daughter asks if spring is coming soon. Matilda lies again. Yes, soon. Very soon. She doesn't mention the hole in the roof that leaks snowmelt onto the hearth, or the rats in the cupboard, or the neighbor who hasn't been seen in days because their cottage door is frozen shut. Instead, she sings an old lullaby in a cracking voice, and the children pretend to sleep to spare her feelings. Outside, the night begins its slow takeover, creeping in with long blue shadows and wind that whispers through the thatch like a thief. Dinner is hot water, flavored with dried onion skin and boiled with 2 marrowless bones she's used 3 times already. She saves the bones like they're heirlooms. The taste is more memory than flavor. One of the children coughs blood into his sleeve. She sees it, pretends she doesn't. There's nothing to be done. Medicine is a prayer the poor can't afford. That night, Matilda dreams of bread. Not coarse, gritty rye bread, but soft, pillowy wheat bread with a crust so golden it gleams. In her dream, it is endless, loaves stacked to the ceiling. She wakes with tears on her cheeks and her tongue still moving as if chewing. The frost on the window is thicker than ever. One of the hens is dead, frozen where it stood. She says a blessing and plucks it. It smells like old feathers and dust, but it will be soup today, and bones tomorrow, and broth for 3 days after that. She removes the heart and saves it for her sick child, hiding it in a bowl under the blanket like a secret. Outside, someone is burning something that smells like fabric and desperation. Matilda closes the shutters and lights a candle, the last one. She places it in the center of the room, its tiny flame rebellion against the darkness. She tells the children stories of a place called Italy, where oranges grow on trees and olives fall from the sky like gifts. They don't believe her, not really, but they smile. That night, the wind howls like it's trying to steal the last breath from the world. Matilda holds the goat in her lap like a dog. The children sleep in a pile like puppies, wrapped in each other's arms and dreams. She keeps watch. The door rattles in its hinges. She prays it stays closed. The next morning, the river has frozen solid. The baker hasn't lit his oven in days. There's no smell of bread on the air. The church bell tolls once, not for prayer, but for a death. Matilda pulls on her boots, still crusted with old snow, and begins her walk to the village green, where they distribute charity. A loaf of bread if you're early, a slap if you're late. She waits in line for 3 hours, holding her place like it's a job. When her turn comes, the nun eyes her with suspicion, then hands her half a loaf and a sermon. Matilda takes both. At home, she cuts it into sixths. Her piece is the smallest. As always, days pass, then weeks, then months. The frost grows softer. The roof drips faster. One morning, the goat births twins, one stillborn, the other barely alive. Matilda coaxes it to life with drops of boiled milk and whispered threats. The children begin to smile again, once a day, then twice, then more. The snow melts. The path to the forest reappears. The first green shoot breaks through the mud, and Matilda falls to her knees to kiss it. She gathers wild garlic. She finds mushrooms. The river thaws. The bread is still stale. The gruel still thin. But there is something new in the cottage now. Not warmth, not comfort, but something close. Spring. The first green sprout that pushed its way through the mud might as well have been a banner of triumph, a tiny rebellion against months of white silence and hunger, so loud it became background noise. Matilda crouched beside it, the tips of her fingers trembling not from cold but from awe, brushing the wet leaves as though they might vanish at her touch. It was wild garlic, pungent and small, its scent more intoxicating than wine and more precious than gold, and when she pulled it from the soil, the children swarmed around her like bees to a bloom, each of them eager to see, to smell, to believe. Spring had come, not with music or festival or the promises of priests, but with weeds, with mud, with wild onions, and Matilda took every bit of it like a sacred offering. The cottage was still drafty, the roof still leaked, and the children still coughed at night, but the light returned to their eyes the same way it returned to the sky, slowly, steadily, until one morning Matilda woke and found herself humming. The forest, once a place of shadow and silence, now rustled with life. The brook, frozen for months, sang again, and its banks offered cress, dandelion, chickweed, things that had no value to a lord, but were miracles to a mother. Each morning, with her apron tied and her eyes scanning the ground like a hawk, Matilda became a forager, a field scholar of edible things. She knew where the sorrel would grow first, how the nettles sting if you picked them wrong, and which mushrooms flirted with death. She taught the children what to look for, giving each of them a woven basket made from last year's reeds, now brittle but useful. They fanned out into the woods like pilgrims seeking relics, their cries of joy echoing through the trees whenever they found something green, something edible, something new. The first meal, made entirely from forage, was a celebration. She boiled water, dropped in chopped nettles, a handful of wild garlic, and the few withered root vegetables she had left from winter's last harvest. She stirred it slowly, lovingly, and when it was ready, she called the children in like it was a feast. They sat cross-legged around the fire, each one holding a chipped bowl, and when they ate, no one spoke. There were no spices, no meat, no bread. Just green, earthy heat. And yet for that one night, the silence was not born of weariness, but of satisfaction. Later that week, she found a patch of wild leeks near the old boundary stone, and it felt like stumbling upon buried treasure. She used some in stew, dried the rest, and stored them in jars she'd washed with scalding water and prayer. The goat, who had nearly wasted away in February, was nursing again, and the kids, both animal and human, fought over the milk. It wasn't enough to make cheese, not yet, but Matilda felt something she hadn't felt in months: margin. Just enough to get through the day without scheming the next meal mid-bite. Then came the return of the bees. One warm afternoon, while walking near the abandoned granary, she heard them. A low buzz, thick in the air like smoke, and followed it to a collapsed tree where a wild hive had made its home. She didn't disturb it, not then, but she marked the spot. She knew how to coax honey without destroying the combs, a trick taught to her by her grandmother, whose bones were now somewhere in the churchyard, under a stone too small to carry her full name. Honey would mean sweetness. It would mean barter. It would mean medicine. She thanked the bees under her breath and left them undisturbed, her basket heavy with clover and anticipation. The village, too, began to stir. Doors creaked open wider. The smell of smoke returned to chimneys, not just for warmth, but for cooking. The blacksmith reopened his forge with a bellow, and the baker, though still stingy, began trading loaves again. Matilda brought him a bundle of wild garlic and nettle in exchange for a round of barley bread, too tough for noble mouths, but perfect for soaking in soup. Word spread that a traveling friar was headed their way, and with him might come spices, or cloth, or gossip from the next shire over. Matilda didn't care about his stories, but she hoped he brought salt. Her last pouch was nearly empty, and the fish she hoped to trade for from the river folk would need preserving. First Sunday after the thaw, the entire village gathered for Mass, thin, underfed, and wrapped in mended cloaks, but alive. Father Anselm spoke of renewal and resurrection, but the real sermon was in the sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows, illuminating the dust in the air like divine glitter. Afterward, the villagers lingered, exchanging news, trading seeds, arranging shared labor. Matilda spoke with Elsie, whose husband had survived the winter, only to break his leg while chopping ice. They agreed to tend each other's plots when planting began. One would work, the other would mind the children. This was how the poor made progress, not through coin, but through barter, through sweat. Soon came planting season. Matilda knelt in the garden plot behind her cottage, tilling the earth with fingers raw from winter and resolve. She planted beans first. They grew fast and strong, and then onions, radishes, and cabbage. Her oldest son dug the furrows. Her youngest placed the seeds. The middle children sang songs to scare away birds. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Every sprout was a line and a prayer, every inch of dark soil a promise. As the days grew longer, the meals grew less desperate. A stew with actual chunks of root, flatbread made from foraged chestnut flour. Once, they caught a hare in the trap Matilda had nearly forgotten she'd set. She roasted it slowly over the hearth, the smell drawing the neighbor's dog to the window. She gave the animal a bone as a bribe for silence. There were still days of hunger, of course, rainy days when nothing could be foraged, cold nights when the goat's milk ran dry. But there was also rhythm, pattern, hope. The children gained weight, their cheeks flushed. They fought again, not out of desperation, but out of play. Matilda caught her reflection in a pool of rainwater one morning and barely recognized herself. The hollowness in her eyes had softened. Her hands still cracked, but her shoulders no longer hunched with exhaustion. She was not healed, but she was healing. Then came May Day. The village held a modest celebration, no maypole, no feasting, but wreaths were woven from blooming branches, and children were allowed to dance. Matilda let her youngest wear a crown of daisies, and when he laughed, truly laughed, the other mothers turned to watch. That sound hadn't been heard since last summer. She made a tart that day from nettle, onion, and wild egg, borrowed from Elsie's hen in exchange for herbs. It was the best thing she'd eaten in a year. That night, as she lay in bed beneath the same wool blanket, now washed and freshened with lavender from the hills, she listened to the breeze through the thatch and allowed herself one selfish thought. Maybe, just maybe, this year they would have enough. Not plenty, never that, but enough. Enough to survive without weeping, enough to live without begging, enough to hold off hunger long enough to remember what it felt like to simply eat without fear. And that, in a world built on survival, was its own kind of feast. By the time the sun sat confidently overhead and the ground dried enough to leave no more footprints in the mud, Matilda's village had transformed from a landscape of frost-bitten misery to a canvas of cautious color, where green crept back into hedges and laughter returned in fits and spurts like a song remembered mid-verse. The river, once a frozen ribbon of despair, now danced again, swollen with spring melt and glistening with light. Children, barefoot and loud, skipped stones while their mothers crouched along the banks pulling young watercress and mint, the edges of their skirts soaked and trailing in the flow. Matilda was there too, her feet planted firmly in the new season's mud, fingers aching from the cold but determined, teeth chattering not from fear but from the shock of surviving. A few weeks ago, she dreamed only of warmth and food and sleep. But now her thoughts wandered further, to the market 2 towns over, to the herb patch she once tended near the woods, to the hope that perhaps one of her children might learn to read. These thoughts came shyly, like deer at the edge of the forest, but they came, and that alone was a victory. Her garden plot was thriving in its ragged, beautiful way. The beans had taken root with defiant vigor, the cabbage leaves curled like fists fighting for life, and the onions sent up long shoots like prayer flags. Matilda tended them like children, speaking to them softly, warning off pests with concoctions of ashes and garlic water. Each morning before the others rose, she'd walk barefoot through the rows, pressing her toes into the soil to feel the pulse of life beneath, letting herself believe, just for a breath, that everything would be all right. The goat's milk flowed again, enough for a ladle or two per day, and once a week she churned butter from the cream, rolling it into tiny pats wrapped in dock leaves and hiding them beneath the floorboards like treasure. The hen, miraculously, had survived the winter and now clucked proudly from her perch above the hearth, having laid 4 eggs in as many days, a feat which earned her the children's adoration and more than one stolen crumb. The day the first egg appeared, Matilda gathered the family and boiled it carefully, slicing it into 5 exact pieces and laying each one on a plate with a reverence usually reserved for relics. They ate in silence, slowly, reverently, savoring the miracle. The children asked if there would be another tomorrow. She smiled and said, perhaps, though she already knew the hen had more to give. The village itself began to breathe again, and with breath came motion. The smith's forge roared to life, sending plumes of smoke into the sky like announcements of rebirth. The baker, now that his stores were replenished with spring grains and dried yeast, resumed his daily rounds, lugging a basket of misshapen loaves to the crossroads, where villagers met and bartered what they could. Matilda traded bunches of herbs, bunches of leeks, and once a sprig of early rosemary for a loaf so crusty it could have been mistaken for stone. She softened it with broth and fed it to the baby, who gnawed it like a champion. There was talk now of rebuilding, the roof beams on the blacksmith's house, the well near the chapel that had collapsed during the hard freeze, the broken fence posts on the communal pasture. Matilda volunteered when she could, her strength returning in trickles, her hands cracked but steady. She helped patch Elsie's roof with woven reeds, a patchwork solution at best, but enough to keep the wind out. In exchange, Elsie gave her a handful of barley and a kiss on the cheek. That night, Matilda made barley porridge with a drizzle of goat milk and a pinch of crushed thyme. The children declared it the best thing they'd ever eaten. They were wrong, but she didn't correct them. She had begun collecting dandelion roots, drying them and roasting them by the fire to brew into a bitter drink that almost, just barely resembled coffee. She drank it alone in the early hours before dawn, while the world still slept and the sky bloomed pink with promise. In those quiet moments, she allowed herself to dream of a harvest that wouldn't fail, of a winter that wouldn't kill, of a life that might, just might, allow for more than survival. The children, their cheeks plumper now and their eyes clearer, began returning to the forest, not just to forage, but to play. They built forts from branches, chased beetles through the ferns, and gathered rocks they declared magic. They still helped in the garden, still fetched water and swept the hearth, but they did so with energy now, not dread. Matilda watched them from the doorway with her arms crossed and her heart swelling painfully. She remembered the long days of silence, the fear in their eyes, the dull resignation of the coldest nights. Now there was shouting and singing and argument again. It was glorious. One evening, as the last of the light filtered through the trees, Matilda brought out the last of the flour, a handful of coarse rye gifted by the priest, and mixed it with nettle paste and salt to make flat cakes. She fried them on a stone beside the fire, and the aroma alone brought neighbors to the window. She gave one to each child and one to old Margaret next door, who hadn't been out of bed since her son died in the frost. The old woman cried as she chewed, crumbling the cake with fingers that shook from more than just age. Matilda sat beside her for an hour, speaking of spring onions and garlic shoots and nothing of sorrow. They both knew there were no words that could replace a boy, No recipe that could fill that hole, but a warm cake helped. A little. The friar finally arrived one Saturday, dragging behind him a cart stacked with cloth, candles, spices, and books. He smelled of dust and incense and something tangy. Citrus, maybe. And when he spoke, it was with the weary joy of a man who had seen death and chosen to keep walking. He brought salt, yes, and cinnamon too, though in such small amounts it might as well have been treasure. Matilda traded dried sage and a single boiled egg for a pinch of both, wrapping them in parchment and hiding them beneath her mattress. That night, she made a stew of wild greens and added a single grain of salt and a whisper of cinnamon. The flavor was so unexpected, it made her laugh, and the children joined in, and soon they were all laughing so hard they couldn't eat, though they managed eventually, between giggles and snorts. In that moment, Matilda thought she might never forget what joy felt like when it was completely unearned. The friar also brought news of wars in the south, of plague rumors in the ports, of taxes that would rise again soon. Matilda listened, nodded, stored it all away like another jar of herbs. The world was always breaking somewhere. She had learned to live in the cracks. But the news she truly cared about was local. Old Walter's cow had birthed twins, the barley crop was coming in strong, and someone had spotted strawberries on the edge of the woods. Summer was not far off, and that meant berries, mushrooms, fish, and maybe, just maybe, a roast on Midsummer's Eve. Matilda began preparations for preserving, gathering clay pots, drying herbs, and hanging bundles from the rafters. She was already planning how to salt the goat meat if the time came, how to ferment the cabbage, how to save every morsel without waste. The famine had left its mark. She would never forget what empty truly meant. But now she had tools, skills, and for the first time in a long time, options. She still woke some nights in a panic, hearing phantom screams, feeling cold so deep it made her bones ache. But the warmth returned quicker now. The goat curled beside her. The fire caught faster. The children no longer looked hollow. They looked whole. They looked forward. And in that, Matilda found the strength to keep going. She no longer waited for luck. She planted, she planned, and she prepared. Because in a world that could turn cruel on a whim, readiness was the best armor. And yet, amidst all the worry, all the toil, there was still beauty. In the smell of mint crushed underfoot, in the feel of soil between her fingers, in the way her son's face lit up when he spotted a rabbit in the field, in the way the light came through the window at dusk, bathing the room in gold like a blessing, in the way a single slice of bread, warmed on a stone and brushed with goat butter, could feel like a banquet. The hunger was not gone. The fear had not vanished, but in its place grew something new, slow, green, fragile, and persistent. Hope. By the time summer settled over the land like a warm, generous blanket, the village was almost unrecognizable from the brittle husk it had been just months before. And Matilda, once hunched and hollowed by hunger, now walked the paths between cottages with her shoulders square and her pace steady. A basket swinging from her arm and her braid tucked neatly under a bonnet that no longer hung loose from exhaustion, but was tied with precision, pride, and a faint hint of rosemary oil. The world had bloomed around her, quite literally. The hedgerows were bursting with wild roses and dogwood, the meadows hummed with bees fat on clover, and even the creek, which once carried ice and dead branches, now bubbled happily with fish and frogs, and the laughter of children who no longer had to choose between work and play. Every day brought something new to harvest or trade. Strawberries so red they looked painted, mushrooms fat and earthy from the forest edge, bundles of thyme and yarrow hung from door frames to dry in the sun, and the occasional rabbit caught by her eldest in the snare he'd perfected after a full season of watching his traps come up empty. The goat, now smug with health and milk, gave them a jar's worth each morning and nuzzled Matilda with a bleat of affection every time she passed. The hen had hatched 2 chicks, both scrawny and half-fluffed, and the children named them Bread and Butter, promising never to eat them, though Matilda wasn't so sentimental. Names or not, come winter, sentiment wouldn't fill bellies. Still, she let them pretend, just for now. The garden was a jungle of edible green chaos, beans climbing haphazardly over everything, squash vines spilling like wild stories, onions standing in rows, like soldiers with their heads just above the trench, and cabbage so heavy she had to harvest them with both arms like lifting a sleepy toddler. Her middle daughter had taken to braiding flowers into the drying herbs and claimed it made the food taste prettier. Matilda didn't argue. She appreciated anything that made survival feel less like war and more like ritual. The village had grown louder with life. The smith's boy practiced his hammering with a rhythm that echoed down the hills. Elsie's husband, now healed, shouted at his cow with the same joy he once reserved for feast days. New carts creaked down the road, carrying tins, pots, lengths of cloth, and rumors, always rumors. One traveler claimed the plague had returned to the coast, another said a war was brewing in the south, and yet another swore he saw a woman heal a blind man in exchange for a jug of cider. Matilda listened, stored the useful pieces, and tossed the rest like chaff in the wind. She had more pressing concerns, like how to smoke the last fish caught from the river, or how to stretch the salted goat meat until midsummer. That festival, long anticipated and long postponed by hunger, was finally being planned again. It wasn't going to be grand, no roasted ox or procession of dancers, but there would be bread, there would be herbs, and there would be music. Matilda had begun brewing a small keg of mead from the honey she coaxed from the wild hive with smoke and whispered apologies. It was cloudy and sharp, but it would do. The baker promised flatbread if she brought him wild thyme, and even the priest offered to bless the fields, provided someone fetched him a bottle of elderberry wine. The community buzzed like a hive on the brink of honeying itself. Children rehearsed songs in the fields. Young couples whispered by moonlight. The old folks sat in the sun and remembered past summers when things were both harder and easier, depending on who was doing the remembering. Matilda helped organize the gathering, not because she was a leader, but because people kept asking her what they should do next, and she had grown so used to planning for survival that logistics now felt like breathing. She set the schedule: sunrise bread blessing, mid-morning herb procession, afternoon feast, and an evening dance by the fire. Everyone contributed. One man offered a goose, another promised cheese. The friar, surprisingly generous, contributed dates from his last journey and a whole sack of barley. Matilda's family would bring the stew. She'd already begun drying the nettles and storing marrow bones. On the morning of midsummer, she rose before dawn, washed her face in the cold stream, and stood barefoot in the garden as the sun rose over the trees. The earth smelled alive and damp and hopeful. She whispered a prayer, not to saints or spirits, but to the soil itself, and then returned to the hearth to begin boiling the stew, layering onions, turnips, herbs, and the precious bits of meat she'd saved all season. The children worked beside her without complaint, humming as they cleaned, stirred, gathered flowers for garlands, and wiped down the table with vinegar and mint. By mid-morning, the village green had transformed into a celebration ground. Bunting made from scraps of old linen fluttered from trees. Tables groaned beneath bowls of porridge, loaves of bread, platters of greens, and wooden cups of elderflower cordial. Someone had even made a pie, though it leaned dangerously to the left and oozed plum from one side like a wound. Still, it smelled heavenly. When the stew was ready, Matilda carried it to the center of the green and ladled into bowls, one after the other, until her arms ached and her ladle scraped bottom. The children danced in rings. The musicians played flutes and hand drums, and the old ones nodded with teary eyes, remembering better times and maybe realizing that these, too, were better times. That night, as the sun dipped low and the fire roared to life, Matilda sat beside Elsie and shared of the mead. They passed it back and forth like something sacred. Matilda watched her children dance, her youngest on someone's shoulders, his arms raised like he'd just won a battle. She didn't cry. She'd done that already. What she felt now was deeper, quieter, something like peace, but with sharper edges, because she knew it wouldn't last. It never did. But it was here now, and she was here now, and that was enough. At midnight, when the last song faded and the fire had burned down to coals, Matilda gathered her family and walked home under a sky so full of stars it felt like they might spill. The goat greeted them at the door with a snort. The hen slept soundly. The cottage, for once, didn't feel like a prison or a battlefield. It felt like a home. She laid the children down, tucked them in, and sat by the hearth in silence. The embers pulsed softly. She poured herself the last cup of mead and raised it to no one. Or maybe to everyone. To the dead, to the living, to the hungry and the full, to the field and the fire and the feast. To the next season, whatever it brought. Matilda rose the next morning, not with urgency, but with calm. The air was cool, not biting. The sunlight was soft, not glaring. The house smelled faintly of wood smoke, nettle, and sleep. Outside, the earth was quiet, the way it is only after something sacred has passed. She stood by the garden, now lush and unruly, and let her fingers graze the leaves, as though reacquainting herself with something once lost. The children still slept, their bellies full, their limbs sprawled like they belonged to dreams worth keeping. She walked down to the stream barefoot, stepping over roots and remembering every footfall that had once been a question of survival. She cupped water in her hands and drank slowly, then sat by the edge and let her reflection ripple beside the cattails. She had made it through. Not unscathed, not unchanged, but here, alive, with her family, with her home. In a world that never promised mercy, that never guaranteed anything but toil and frost, she had carved out something gentle, something lasting. And though another winter would come, another hunger would knock, and another struggle would rise, this moment, this fleeting, fragile moment of peace, was hers. And maybe that was the greatest miracle of all. So if you're ever time traveled back into the Middle Ages, now you know, food didn't just suck, it tested you. Every meal was a gamble, every winter was a siege, and survival wasn't luck. It was skill, sacrifice, and sheer stubborn defiance. You wouldn't last a day unless you knew how to turn weeds into dinner, bones into broth, and silence into strategy. But people like Matilda, they didn't just survive, they endured, they remembered, and they built the world we now casually microwave our burritos in. So next time your food delivery's late or your coffee's too cold, just remember, at least you're not eating boiled moss and praying the goat doesn't freeze. Now, if this tale warmed your imagination even half as much as Matilda's soup warmed her hands, give the video a like, maybe subscribe, and let me know in the comments what time you're listening from. Because whether you're in bed, commuting, or curled up with a warm drink, you just survived the Middle Ages. And that deserves a little rest. Good night, sleep well, and may your pantry always be full.